Good morning. Welcome to the panel dealing with uncertainty in digital history research. I've heard this is a highly attended session. I guess we have many visitors on Zoom. I don't see how many persons there are. There's still space for anybody who wants to join. Maybe someone comes in. I will just shortly introduce the panelists to you. We have 3 panelists on site. We have 2 panelists on Zoom. So we switch back and forth again. It will be interesting. I am Torsten, and I will just guide you through the session here. So the speakers today there are those are all the attendants. Great. Welcome. Okay. Have a seat. I was just going to introduce the 5 panelists. Torsten Hiltmann, on the left. He's from the Humboldt University of Berlin in Germany, and he's also very much involved in the National Research Data Infrastructure Consort NFBI for memory. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Then we have online Florian Kräutli. Hi, can you wave? Yeah, thank you. Okay, from the University of Zurich, Switzerland. And then on site, Linda Freyberg from the Leibniz Institute of Research, Information and Education, located in Frankfurt. Is that correct? Berlin. Okay. Okay, I read from Frankfurt somewhere, but
it's our mother institute.
Okay, it's great. Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay. Our next speaker online is I hope to pronounce it correctly. Please correct me. It's Panagiotidou.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I gave my best. From King's College London. And then online, next to me is Florian Windhager from the Danube University in Krems, Austria. And there's the 6 panelists who cannot attend today because she's a fever. With Silke Schwandt from the University of Bielefeld, professor for digital history. She doesn't attend, but the spirit is here in the room. Okay, so we can start. And Torsten is going to give us an introduction.
Good morning, everyone. And since Silke can't be there, and usually it was Silke's part also to give the introduction, I will try, or just try to fix in the last 2 days or yesterday, a little bit of introduction in uncertainty and history, so that we have nevertheless a good start and some foundations to build on afterwards. So, and the first question, of course, would be what is uncertainty and what is uncertainty in the context of historical research. And if we want to define uncertainty, it would be the easiest and the shortest way to say it's a lack of information. So a lack of information to hold any argument, any statement true. But if you look in historical research, due to the fact that we are working with historical sources, which are either they are there or not, or incomplete and so on, we have many different levels of uncertainty there. The first one, of course, is on completeness, whether sources are handed down to us or not, or as you can see, whether they have truths or not. Next thing is ambiguity, for instance, difficulties in reading or identification, but we can't decide one side or the other, how we should read a certain letter or a certain word, or how we should identify a person with just named William in any source. There's vagueness, the lack of accuracy in information. We all know that it's difficult to quantify something like a huge crowd we have here. So to quantify this, because this the boundaries of this category are not defined. So it is difficult also to deal with this uncertainty because everyone understands something different by, for instance, a huge crowd, and we can't really put it to a clear, precise information. Then, of course, we have the changing of meaning, depending on time, place, and context, depending on the person who's speaking, depending on the time or the place. Certain terms can mean different things, and it brings in, of course, also a degree of uncertainty. And especially for history, it's also demanding perspectivity, which is important. So that we have different assessments done by different persons, depending on their viewpoint, but they always have also a certain agenda and all different degrees of reliability. So we have contradicting information, and we have to sort out and which we could trust or not, or how we should combine them. And all this can take place in very different stages in our process of knowledge production. Even at the event itself or at the historical event itself, things can be uncertain, but also in the source and representation of the source, reading of the sources, in our way to reconstruct or also to read other interpretations done by other historians. If you look at the classical hermeneutic process of what we could call producing historical knowledge, and we could also discuss about knowledge and information and understanding, but just to make it short, we have this process between the source and our understanding, and everyone is aware of this, at least historians, that we have this hermeneutic circle where we go from the source to our understanding, we try to put it in larger context. This context gives us more information about the source, and so we can back and forth to create an understanding and build what one could call a process of modeling a narrative, which then we present in talks like this one, or in papers and monographs. And this modeling process is what is the goal of this classical hermeneutic process. So in the end, we come up with a model and we present this. And of course, we have to deal there also with uncertainty. Okay, that's my French background. Okay, and when in this process we are dealing, of course, with uncertainty, but we have different. We are always trying to reduce uncertainty in this context. So we have different methods like source criticism to try to reduce uncertainty, or also to avoid uncertainties, because in this process, we can only take a certain number of uncertainties in our calculation, and so we try also to be selective, or be it that we do it consciously or unconsciously, that we try to be selective in different kinds of uncertainties we choose for our narrative, and then we have different strategies to express it. But the major thing is that we try to avoid or to reduce it here. If you look at the data-driven hermeneutic process, and the process is totally different. We have a source system. We have first to transfer the sources of information in sources into data, into digital data. Then we process them by different methods. And then we have to represent the results of this processing, or data processing and visualization. And we have here then this process that we have to try to create an understanding and interpret this interpretation, this visualization, and interpret and then build our second model and so on. Because the advantage of this data-driven approach, of course, is that we can now work with a corpus, with a whole bunch of sources, so we can scale up our process, not only working with some samples we have chosen, will be encountered, but really with large collections of data and large collection of sources. But in order to do so, we need a model, a data model. And this is the critical part, because we should have a formal model, a formal data model, which of course we model theory, we construct this in a process of selection, of abstraction, and always guided by a certain purpose. And the problematic part is that instead of building a model in the end, like in the classical hermeneutical process, we have to understand already on everything about, almost everything, about our sources, about our purpose, about our topic, in order to be able to create a good and valid model or data model for our research, on which we can then be based on for our different methods and our applications. So this kind of understanding our sources and our problems and our research question is not the end of the process, but we have to put it in the front, which means we need a lot of understanding, a lot of expertise to create such a model. And of course, in this model as well, we need to integrate uncertainties. And we must address them, we must deal with them, because we have to select which kind of information do we take, at which degree, to which granularity we want to represent this information from the sources. And so we have also to deal with all these kinds of uncertain readings, conflicting statements, incompleteness, and so on. And I want to focus now in my part a little bit deeper in this question of formalization, because there are different processes. Often it's confounded with we confound modeling and formalization. And modeling is, as I said, the process of create a specific representation of something in the world through a process of selection and abstraction, and every model is always driven by a certain purpose. But I can have also an informal model. Also my paper or my monography on a certain topic is a model of the thing I want to describe and I want to explain. What's the difference then for in the data-driven approach is that we need also a formalization, because we need a formal model. And formalization means to express this model in a specific symbolic system in a formal way, so to express it as discrete data. And just to give an example, is always the question, how do I represent dates in my data model? And I can do it, for instance, in plain text. It would also formalize the model if I say I represent date information in plain text. I could do it in an ISO or XML datetime format in eDTF or inside of CRM. And I have to decide which way I do it to be able to and to understand what are the consequences of these decisions and how I can deal with it and how I can deal with uncertainty. And it's only through this process of formalization that we can really process this information computationally, or do also the logical reasoning of it, and which is the most important part, to scale it up on large collections of data collections or data sources. And if we come to the question of formalization and uncertainty, there are 2 points. The first is that by this rigor of formalization, I'm certain everyone knows this part. By the rigor of formalization, we are often forced to make decisions. And only by this rigor of formalization, when we have to decide, it becomes clear where are things not certain, where is uncertainty, and where are we hesitating to make a decision, and it means we are not certain. So we learn a lot by bringing data into a formalized, in a formal structure. But the other thing is that this formalization can also help us to express and to capture uncertainty in a desired specificity and make it computational or computable. And for this, I think we need a theory on better understanding what uncertainty actually is, because this would be the basis for a firm process of formalization of uncertainty, so that we have an understanding how does uncertainty work, so that we can render it or represent it in a specific way and deal with it. And it would help not only to integrate uncertainty in our analysis, but also improve scalability and increase interoperability. And of course, there are some theories and models of different kinds of uncertainty out there in different other fields, like in computer science or mathematics. However, as you can see here, this is an example taken from Piotrowski, which he brought the SMETS, that all these models of uncertainty in other fields and other disciplines do not really apply, I think, to our field of history, because we work a little bit differently. We have a different situation in matters of our sources and how we deal with information, and for instance, that we are not driven by rules, but rather trying to create a plausibility or make a plausible argument, for instance. But there are different dimensions of uncertainty which may be considered for such kind of a more theoretical approach. As I said already, place in the process of knowledge production, types of information. You could ask whether, for instance, uncertainty is the same thing for representation of time, which is linear, or which space, with space, or for identification or classification. Does uncertainty work always in the same manner, or do we have different kinds of uncertainty depending on the type of information? Or is it the reasons, whether there are gaps or lacuna, or is there unclear interpretation of the source, or contradictions and so on? On the different ways we establish statements for certainty. So is it by justification, so that we create plausibility because we refer to an authority, or by logical inference, or by comparison, for instance, or also probability using AI models. And also on precision, like I explained with vagueness and ambiguity, but also the question whether I can decide something or not, whether if I find more information, is it possible to find more information to clear some uncertain parts up or not, and whether it's also the validity, so whether it's dependent on certain conditions. And I think this is something very specific, I would say, for historical research, that is always depending on the context, on the certain perspective and the purpose, because we try to establish not rules, not a truth, but plausibility for a certain argument. So, and to come to my end, not to my end, but the end of my part, two takeaways. The first one is, I think that especially, or particularly for the field of history, but perhaps also digital humanities in general, we should really go more forward in embracing this potential of computational approach. What do I mean by this? I think, at least in history or digital history, we're often still driven by the thinking or the approach or attitude in classical hermeneutics, so that we have this tendency to create unambiguity, so to leave out uncertainties or to create certainty. So, for instance, if we take in some information in a data model, we try to be sure and we try to give one answer, for instance, until we really feel uncomfortable with it, and then we try to build up something or to notice uncertain. And we could turn this around and really to take different possibilities and to create or take in the uncertainty up to the point where we are really certain, for instance, that a thing is true. So to change this, the attitude towards uncertainty and to incorporate it in our models, in our process of analysis. And the other thing is to embrace the virtues of documentation. Because this process of modeling and formalization, and I hope I could make this clear, is really the critical part, or a really critical part of dealing with our data, with our information, and with uncertainty in historical data. So it should be adequately documented, also justified and made explicit in the documentation, like, for instance, the annotation guidelines. Then often we just model to get to the point where we can analyze them, but the modeling process and the way we deal with uncertainty, for instance, in the context, it really matters. And that's why I also think that, for instance, modeling and formalization, but also the documentation and most of the documentation of it, is not a necessary nuisance, but really an original and fundamentally scholarly contribution, which we should value more and really see it as this as a really fundamental scholarly contribution, which involves a lot or a great deal of expertise. Because in order to model and in order to incorporate and formalize uncertainty, you need really a lot of information and knowledge on the field, on the subject, but also on processes, on and methods and so on. So really to balance this approach, and perhaps in the end, the collection of different documentation of different annotation guidelines may also help us to create a better understanding of uncertainty and perhaps also a more theoretical approach to uncertainty in digital history. Thank you. Now we will continue with Florian Kräutli, one of our Florians, who will go a little bit deeper into a specific case of modeling of uncertainty in social in pressure data.
Thank you. Could you unshare your screen so I can share mine?
Okay, please, Pfizer. Great.
There we go, that looks good.
Your screen, you can go ahead.
Excellent. So following what Torsten said about formalizing things, I'm going to go a bit deeper into how to practically do that in a data model. And I'm looking at uncertainties in cultural data, more specifically cataloging data of digital collections. And we mostly deal here with data that is already there in some way, because collections have grown over decades and have often also made transitions from physical to digital. But we're also going to deal with cataloging data that is just being created. And as an example of uncertainty, I'm just focusing here on dates. Dates that are often recorded as both free text and as well as numeric date brackets. For example, in the 1950s can be the 1950 to 1959. And then the curators collections I talk to, they primarily consult the free text. Often they are not even aware that the numeric data representation is there. It's only used for searching, and it's in some cases also calculated automatically. So some examples of how this is here in Cooper Hewitt. Here we have mid-20th century, which is here translated to 1940 to 1958. 58 because we have an acquisition date. So we see we actually have here some certainty, but we not necessarily have it represented in the data, but we can kind of derive it from our understanding of the entire record. This one is also a nice one, possibly circa 1960, that conveys a certain uncertainty, and translates to 1955 to 1965. I also looked at some samples of the V&A collections, just kind of how they describe data. There's a huge variety, even kind of in how we say circa, if you write it out, or you see dot. So in expressing uncertainty, we also have a lot of variety. So why is this problematic, or why can it be problematic? Well, first of all, we have this relationship between textual and numerical date, and as Torsten said, the digital requires us to formalize it. So the numerical data are actually a requirement of the digital, and it's always required. It's even when it's hidden, because we digital with data, and it also poses a bit issues with proposals like you see on the right of kind of introducing uncertainty in visualization, because in the end, if you have a digital visualization, you always need to say, okay, where does like a squiggly line start, where does it end? So numerical dates always kind of introduce certainty where there might not be certainty. There's also some intransparency of why it's there. So I talked to software developers of collection management systems. They say, when we have circa, we just add 5 years plus minus, which is what we have seen before in the 1950s. But obviously, it can be something different. And also, if you have something like 1900s, 5 years won't do. You're probably looking at bigger pictures. And also, the range could mean different things. Often you have just one date. But an object could be made at some point, it could be changed at some point, so the object changes over time, so we could have several dates. Very often we only have the possibility to input one date, and one date with certainty. I think the most important is probably the reasons. So, what is the reason for possibly circa 1960s? And that is often missing, mostly because the collection management systems do not allow for making such statements. So sometimes, as you see, we can imply it by relating it to an acquisition date, but it's very seldomly made explicit why something is uncertain. And I also came across, that's also against the context that Torsten mentioned. Sometimes it's institutional knowledge. So that's the diaries of Benjamin Britten, who kind of kept very detailed diaries until 1938 and between 28 and 38, but not before then. So that context gives us a way of interpreting uncertainties, but we don't have it in the data usually. It's kind of in the institutions and people who take care of the data. So how can we deal with this? How can we add context? How can we kind of make this uncertainties more explicit? And I'm going to just show some practical approaches from two projects. One is the Bilder der Schweiz Online, Images of Switzerland. It's a project where we aggregate from 3 different collections, historical images of Switzerland. So collections that have been grown over time and have been handled by different persons. And on the other hand, we have the digital collection of the Foundation for Art, Culture and Society, which is a huge collection just collected by a single person and with kind of minimal cataloging. And they're just now in the process of cataloging and dating some of these objects. The data model that we use in both projects is based on CDOC CRM, which allows us to focus more on the process rather than fact. So we have a date. It's not as a fact, but it's kind of we can add more context as what it relates to. And we have it in linked data, and that means every piece of data is an addressable entity. That is something that is quite practical because it allows us to say something about anything, and it also allows us to have multiple and conflicting information, which I think is quite crucial for expressing uncertainties. So some practical examples. So we have here in the collection of the SKKG, 4 candlesticks, and we have the date vermutlich 19. Jahrhundert, probably 19th century. So how is that represented in our data model? Well, first of all, we make explicit that this refers to the production date, which the data is not only implicit about. So we create a production, and we say the production has a time span, which is our probably 19th century. And obviously we also have the brackets, it's from 1801 to 1900. What we do then, we also have kind of broader concept of a period, and we extract also this qualifier, we call it. So we say that there is a process that assigned this probably, and that's now all we know. But it means that we also have now a way of saying more about why this is probably, because we have some point where we can address this. So this is a way how we can add more information. For example, here this painting landscape at Avignon. It has a time span of 1965, and we again have this attribute assigned. We say, well, this date has been assigned because the image is dated. So we know that there is some certainty, or at least we know that there is a source for the date, which is on the painting itself. Or in this case, necklaces from Neolithicum. We have a date Neolithicum, which was motivated by an expert. So these are the kind of sources that we can add, and we can add more sources and as well conflicting dates. In the Bilder Schweiz online project, we have this example where we develop a platform which can then be used by expert users, for example, also to correct things or make additional statements. So for example, here we have a date that comes from the original collection, but we have our research, we say, well, this is not correct according to our sources. And we have here a different date. And both these statements can exist at the same time, and both have the sources of their, who said what. And it's a simple form for the researcher, say true or false, we have notes. But in the background, we have a model based on the Cytoxerum argumentation model, which says, we looked at this image and we said this one is wrong, and we made this information with these sources, which can then also be added and displayed in the front end. So that is something that we're kind of striving for, because we talk to researchers and curators, and they often say, well, the database interfaces do not allow us to express the uncertainties that we want. And what we try to do is to kind of make a balance between interfaces that are still usable for well, not computer science experts, but then which are in the background creating the data models and modeling data, what allows us to express certainty a bit better. So the platform is online, all code is available there. And now I pass on to Linda.
Florian. Yes, switching to on-site again. Again, I can just start. Hello, everyone. I'm Linda, and in the following about 10 minutes, I will introduce visual and semantic search interfaces as a strategy to deal with uncertainty, because we obviously can't get rid of it. In particular, in historical sources, using multimodal data in the history of education as an example. One second. In historical research, we are facing uncertainty, as Torsten mentioned in the beginning, already with and within the original sources. These sources are multimodal, including all types of data, like documents, archival sources, images, video, or 3D objects. Here on the slide on the left-hand side, you see an archival handwritten document, as well as a black and white photo of a teacher from the end of the 19th century. And on the right-hand side, it's a screenshot, which I will talk about later. In the history of education in particular, the research often focuses on formal organizations like administration, bureaucracy, or the school system, where in particular, in the latter, individual actors like teachers are not well documented or known. This often leads to challenges to identify persons and differentiate them from each other. Also, in standardized vocabularies, like the GND of the German National Library, the person does not appear because he or she did not publish anything and therefore has no entry there. Or there are many persons with the same name and you have no further context information available as birth dates, for instance. And therefore you cannot tell which person it is, as you can see in the screenshot of the search interface on the right-hand side here. This uncertainty on a source level leads to representation issues in the database. But in the realm of digital humanities, it's all about representation. So let's have a look at how meaning is generated in data on a sign level. So we are getting a bit theoretical here, but only very briefly, don't be afraid. Following the universal science theory of child-centered first, all thinking is conducted in science. So therefore, it's a really good theory to apply to the digital realm, I would say. I mean, I'm a huge Peirce fan, so if you want to talk to me about Peirce, data, go ahead. I will be very happy about that. And first of all, an object, a person, a data, location is digitally represented. The representation relation is shaped by symbolic embedment in terms of a certain cultural and historical context. The entities are linked to other objects, which build a network of relations, activating sign processes. And exactly this semantic contextualization can be useful to reduce uncertainty by making these networks visible. On a data level, a proper semantic description based on a reference model like CDOC-CRM, which Florian mentioned earlier in detail, can provide for context. Here you see a visualization of the structure of CDOC-CRM, in particular the entity classes which are available. With this event-driven model, using properties to link entities, a structure of statements is built and historical developments can be represented. In this example, which you can see here, modeling structure of a historical print is displayed. So on the left-hand side, you see the print, which is a human-made object. You really have to think about and reflect on what kind of objects you are using in your collection or you deal with. And in this example, there are many persons involved with different roles. In the middle part in blue, we have two actors who brought the print, the historical print, in existence, and the artist who created it. So there are two different persons. Then we have other persons involved, like in the right down part, because there's a person depicted on the print. So you can see there are many persons involved. This dense semantic structure can reduce uncertainty to a certain degree by providing for context. Like Susan Brown pointed out in her opening keynote, CDOC-CRM is a very sophisticated and powerful model, but it takes a lot of time and effort to model everything, and you really have to be pragmatic to decide on which is really necessary to model in depth. But these semantic structures and networks, which I showed you, are hidden on a structural metadata level. So it is crucial to make these structures accessible by, for instance, visual search interfaces. In our institute, we conducted a co-creation workshop last year to gather ideas for our database interfaces, which is basically a library database interface. Besides the free search field, which is, you can see here in blue, and which is very popular still, visual search entry points like maps and timelines were proposed, as you can see on the left-hand side. On the right side, there was a bit more of innovative ideas. There's a topic-based search, which was proposed by the researchers, which algorithmic elements using individual preferences of former searches. So how can you implement such an algorithmic search? It already has been done in the realm of cultural heritage data, in particular for exploring museum objects. This visual algorithmic search has implemented by the UC Lab and.Torsten. And in this visual search, over 5,000 museum objects from the 19th century here of two Berlin State Museums are accessible, clustered by keywords. An algorithm orders the objects by similarities, providing an overview and also a close reading of the single object by linking to the catalog entry. These search strategies reduce uncertainty by providing context and making data structures visible and accessible. And another strategy to deal with uncertainty is visualization. And with this, I'm handing over to Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen now. Great. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen now? And okay, great. And I guess you can hear me as well. So I'm going to talk to you about uncertainty in the visualization of it. So I'm Georgia, I'm an assistant professor at King's, and part of my research focuses on how people handle issues such as biases, uncertainties, frictions, when using data representations in interdisciplinary domains like digital humanities and sustainability. And I wanted to talk about my first-hand experiences with this in uncertainty in data visualization. So I come from design and computer science. I'm not a historian. I've worked with archaeologists quite closely. And my experience starts in Southwest Turkey, where I was following a group of archaeologists to see how they collect, document, and represent their data in order to make interpretations. So I wanted to see how they actually worked with data. What they were doing is that they were actually systematically, they were field survey archaeologists. So they were systematically examining and collecting pottery sherds from different fields with varying extents of visibility. Then they inspected really closely those found sherds and their material, their color, the fabric, and the shape, among other things, in order to kind of date them and put them on a kind of chronology. And my goal here was to actually take all this information and create a visualization of their site dataset, basically a spatio-temporal dataset that represents the historical locations of human activity based on where they found those pottery sherds. And they wanted to uncover patterns of how these sites changed a long time, and were they continuous or there was instability over different periods of time and so on. So I got excited. That's a perfect data visualization problem. So I started making these, I call them time prints. They're little spark lines, basically like signals, where I felt that they embodied the concept of continuity. And in the beginning, these archaeologists were quite excited. They liked it because, as you can see also quite clearly here, like you can see clusters of different sites. Okay, so one line is one site, and the time is time chronology. So when there is a peak, it means that there is probably human activity during that time. So they could see clusters of different locations functioning in a different way. And I got excited also that I managed to make something useful for them. But their excitement actually left because I discovered something that I had been reading in digital humanities literature, is that the visualizations often look too objective to be representative of the messiness of the humanistic data. So what was happening in that case is that they knew that these sites, these data sets, were not actually objective. Like the patterns that were appearing there were actually, some of them, they didn't trust the underlying data because they knew who had collected those pottery sherds, because they knew that these fields were on the mountain and they were more difficult to find sherds. So there was actually a lot of things happening underneath, as Florian also mentioned before, the context. We call this implicit error, but it's what Florian was referring to, I think, before, as institutional knowledge that these people had about this data. So what happened here is like, okay, I changed the visualization, but I also started wanting to understand how do other people represent uncertainty in humanistic data. So along with colleagues, we conducted a systematic literature review, because that's what we do in computer science. And we wanted to see, like, this is like the systematic part of it. We wanted to understand papers that use in digital humanities that use data visualization as their research method. And we wanted to understand how they were representing uncertainty and how they were coping with it. We ended up with a corpus of 126 publications. And just to clarify, because this was important for our systematic review, when we wanted to be inclusive in our term of uncertainty. So we meant things like moments of doubt or ambiguity in the data analysis process. And I'll give you some examples of how that manifested in the real corpus of our data. So first we looked at the visualization parameters, such as the original data source, what kind of data they were abstracting, the type of visualization, what kind of software they were used. And here are some examples of some of the visualizations that we saw in these digital humanities publications. And then we examined the origins of uncertainty. And we did that by reading through all the articles and basically highlighting moments like here, where the authors mention 18th century spelling is notoriously inconsistent, addresses notoriously vague until street numbers were introduced in the 1760s. So we counted that as a moment of uncertainty that could be represented in the final visualization that we're using in their article. And what we saw is that here we also captured to see how they were representing uncertainty. You see a map here, for instance, that shows that there is missing data. And then the main finding of this work was that most scientists were actually representing the data textually rather than in their visualizations. Only 20 of the 83 papers that discussed uncertainty actually represented that visually. So besides what we're discussing here and the efforts we're making, this doesn't seem to have caught up necessarily in how the work that is being published. And we use these 20 visualizations to kind of make a very crude classification of basically try to understand how they were representing uncertainty. So one was the established methods, which is what you would expect. You have like hashed lines over a map to show missing data, or you have like error bars, very tiny error bars on a line graph to show differences in like, computational error. Then we found some dedicated methods. There were some papers that were explicitly trying to like in this case, to disambiguate different characters, entities in a book character network. So they made a data visualization in order to work around that uncertainty of which characters were which. But I think the most interesting things we found is that some researchers were actually kind of hacking or tricking their visualization tools to depict some sort of uncertainty. For instance, here there was a missing geolocation of folktales in the Netherlands, and in order not to ignore data points that didn't have a location, they actually put a big bubble in the middle of the sea, as you can see, to kind of capture this uncertain data that is being there. So they're using improvisational methods. And yeah, for us, this indicates a little bit, at least for me, that indicates that there is a need for more out-of-the-box tools for research, for humanistic research to visualize uncertainty. Because I think that what's happening here is that you need the researchers are actually appropriating their tools in ways that can kind of try to build them, to shape them into the ways that they need to in order to represent it. And then finally, we also found a more experiential approach to depict uncertainty, which tried to give the impressions of it rather than actually quantifying it. So here, this is an example from Pliny, I think it's called, where it says that to allow for more ambiguous relationship among documents, the authors used proximity. So they mentioned that putting two items together, close enough together, suggests some degree of connection, but without actually need to be quantified or to be spelled out explicitly. So that, I think, is an interesting kind of way to experientially kind of indicate some things without quantifying them. So this leaves us with some open questions, I believe. Like, do we need to establish common visual vocabulary to represent uncertainty in the age? And should we use findings like we were mentioning before, like modeling and standards to show how we're supposed to visualize it as well, not just capture the uncertainty? And then is it preferable to encourage more experiential approaches to uncertainty? So data feminism, for instance, calls for more experiential approaches to uncertainty as well. And then the other thing is, how does it change to do that depending on the audience? And what I want to show here is how data journalists, for instance, do their effort to communicate their data, their uncertainty. Here you see, I don't know who has seen this. This is quite old already. It's from the New York Times, where the point is to the uncertainty of the results of the elections was indicated through this gauge that was moving, that was animated, and that made people very uncomfortable. Like it literally made them feel uncertain. So that's a way to actually go forward for that. Or another way to show that, in the data journalism shows uncertainty is, for instance, this Mona Chalabi that hand draws the visualizations in order to kind of highlight the fact that the data is not objective. So the hand-drawn version of the visualization kind of stops it looking so perfect, so objective, so so certain in a way. And I want to close just with this, that coming back to the archaeologists that I started talking about. So I mentioned I created another version of the visualization that they added, and this is it. Just, I'm not going to go through it. I just want to give you a screenshot, but to let you know that there were some ways to handle uncertainty and to visualize it. And there was like custom ways to include the different implicit errors that they were discussing in their in the visual. And then again, they got excited about it, and they were really appreciated that I took these into account as a computer scientist working with them. But then after some time, when I went back to them, they didn't need it. They didn't need the visualization of uncertainty because they were so tacitly knowledgeable about their data that they didn't actually need this external representation. Or maybe, of course, this could be a problem of the way that it was designed, but I also think it says something about how disciplines actually form their knowledge and the epistemology of it, and how uncertainty can be just part of that, and it doesn't necessarily need to be visualized. And with that, I hand over to Florian.
Thanks so much, Georgia. Hello, everyone. My name is Florian, and I'm happy to follow up on the input so far and to elaborate a bit more generically on some last thoughts about uncertainty visualization and representing uncertainty. The takeaway will be mind your users. It's a bit of a truism in visualization design, but I want to make the case for the value of being specifically aware of this problem in, for example, visualization of cultural collection or digital history data, as we are usually operating between two power blocks that work quite differently, and you can react quite differently to uncertainty visualization. Okay. This has been established. We don't have to elaborate on that. Uncertainty is a reality in DH and in history and in different cultural sciences, and the magic certainly does not exist. We also don't want it, and we know to build up trust for visualization tools. Yeah, we follow a certain standard rationale. That has been spelled out like this. It works very well with standard recommendations in visualization research. Do not lie with your visualization. Do not fudge or prettify the data. So if it's uncertain, you should make it look certain. And just strive for excellent representation and make, for example, data quality transparent. Right? This is just the case for show the quality, the certainty, the completeness, certainty or uncertainty of your data, and basically that's what we have discussed so far. There is a paper that is usually heavily cited in this context, and it also makes the case for represent data uncertainty, because that's the only way to actually generate trust in your users. It's referencing another field, like, for example, criminal investigation, and there it's obvious if the analyst is not aware of uncertainties, they may not only waste their time, but follow wrong leads and even incriminate innocent people. So it's therefore crucial for users to be provided with accurate estimations of uncertainties so that they can trust the knowledge. Now, in DH or in history, we don't can mess up that badly, arguably, but still, for example, you can lose trust of your colleagues if you just look at improper representations and just draw the wrong conclusions. So the thesis of this last input is we have to be aware when representing uncertainty. Here, this or visualization dog should hint to the fact yes, we are barking up the wrong tree when representing uncertainty, but we should be aware that there are more trees, and they are not impressed with our work, and we can even generate the opposite effect. I want to emphasize the group of non-experts or casual users on the one hand side, and traditional humanities experts, mostly working with texts and hermeneutic methods on the other side. Yes, and I just want to quickly elaborate on that. First, let's start with recap. What can be uncertain when you, for example, just visualize a large image collection? We look at the threatened swarm from Jan Asselein here. Obviously, we have metadata that is, for example, in the catalog and that has been just already known before things have been digitized. Then we have extracted features that we can just directly grab from the image. And this is what we mostly visualize when we visualize large image collections. But I want to also point out, yeah, for example, feature extraction even gives you some certainty scores, as you know. But what is even more interesting, I think, is that traditional humanists are not interested so much in this sort of metadata, just maybe to support their reasoning, but they are mostly about the meaning of signs, symbols, images, the motivation, why they have been reduced, the relevance of it. When this happens on a textual basis, for example, it explains to you, yeah, there is a swan, but it's important there is this dog here, and the dog wants to fetch the eggs. This one fence it. So just the basic description of what it means hits on this explicit layer, and then it explains why is the painting relevant, because it symbolizes a Dutch statesman who defended the young Dutch nation against the English. So this became one of the most important paintings and was the first painting in the Rijksmuseum that has been visited. This is all done with textual interpretations, and there is an inherent uncertainty there, as we know. It's about making different interpretations as solid as possible, but also generating new interpretations over time, which are sort of in constant debate with each other. So metadata uncertainty, but also interpretive uncertainty, and the case will be that we usually lose touch with the part on the right-hand side and the visualizations. Okay. Now, types of metadata uncertainty are many. We have already heard a bit from Florian Kräutli and also from George about temporal uncertainty. We did, for example, a study about different types of uncertainty in cultural collections. You can see on the right-hand side different types of temporal uncertainty, and we can do these reflections for each subtype. Then it's about how to encode them, and there we have different solutions. You might be aware of this chart from Joseph Priestley, one of the earliest representations of biographies and also uncertainties in dates. Florian Kräutli also referenced his work where he applied different uncertainty encodings of dates and uncertain dates in cultural collections. Yeah, and then, for example, here is a part of our work that we tried to visualize uncertainty for different biographical events by shape and color, and or another recent work where we tried to visualize the uncertainty of library collection. Librarians didn't really know what is part of the historical collection or what has been added later on. This are just 3 examples, and we collected some ways to encode uncertainty here with this paper. You see, for example, for geographic uncertainty, there are various encoding techniques that have been collected by geographers. There are linear encoding techniques for temporal uncertainty, but also for network graphs. You have different ways to encode uncertainty. For example, how likely connecting link between two nodes does actually exist. It's an impressive sort of vocabulary. The problem is, if you represent uncertainty, you have to at least use a part of the visual vocabulary, part of the visual variables for representing uncertainty. And this adds an additional layer of visual complexity. And now that's the trade-off you have to be careful about. Because you take your average course-directed graph, it's already complex. Now you have to decide which attributes to visualize. And then you have to put like uncertainty data on top. Right? And it's just an additional layer of complexity that has also been coded on the other side. And that's where you can easily lose, for example, non-experts which already have a hard time reading your graph. And it's sort of read-by version. Okay, so it's very important to ask for whom do you produce your uncertainty visualizations. And I mentioned casual users, they have specific tasks, for example, which is no specific task. Oftentimes they want to just explore a collection. The only risk is that they get bored and you lose them because they turn elsewhere. And we know a lot how interfaces for them should be actually designed. And to make it maybe a bit too simple, but just as a takeaway, in case of doubt, do not burden them with all too much uncertainty you know about. Build like a second layer of your interface that is simplified, that just allows you to communicate the basic facts. You can add all sorts of layers in the or impressum section, what it did, but you are probably risking to lose them if you put too much weight on them. So just summing up, the casual user isn't really into uncertainty and a lot of discussion about it. Good enough designs are the way to go forward. Also, yes, look at your user experience, your usability, the clarity of the design. Just make sure that you don't use them. Maybe they want to dive deeper later on. Now, on the other hand side, non-digital experts and traditional humanists, they have other risks. They trust, they are also interested in uncertainty, but I just want to make the case they are interested in another sort of uncertainty, and this kind of creative uncertainty. And they are usually not very impressed even by advanced uncertainty visualizations because they know there is a lot of leeway, there's a lot of actual discourse that they are usually engaged in, and there it's a complex negotiation of interpretive positions and of uncertainty. And for this user groups, I think it's the best recommendation to acknowledge this and also to integrate this sort of interpretive complexity and uncertainty in your interface on a textual basis. So, throwing things together and wrapping up, given this two big power blocks that are surrounding our work, the standard rationale is good. We should represent uncertainty, but we should mind our uses. We should know, on the other hand, non-experts, which usually are scared away with too much visual complexity, and on the other hand, experts, which usually cannot be really impressed with data visualization. So, starting with the dog barking up the wrong tree, I found this image online, which is, I guess, a Halloween costume for your dog. Three-headed Cerberus, and this allows me to sum up, keep up the uncertainty visualization for experts, for DH experts, acknowledge differences between metadata visualization and uncertainty, and the uncertainty of the facts, and on the other hand, forget about all too much uncertainty visualization for your non-experts and casual users, but produce compelling and good insights for them. Very last slide shows you, we tried to do this in a recent project that here just encodes 3 different regions of Salzburg in Austria and their cultural heritage. As you can see, it's a three-dimensional timeline. We place objects where they are according to this three-dimensional line. And we chose a very simple design where the objects are precisely placed at first sight. That's for non-experts. And then for experts, we chose like not so salient encoding that showed it's just a shade of blue, that the actual uncertainty is this line. So we place the object here, but if you're interested in the actual knowledge we have, then it's this whole dimension and not this one point. And obviously you can easily combine your visualization interfaces with text, and there you can do justice to uncertainty. That's about it. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm happy to hand over to you.